Are you holding?
Okay. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Bava Basra Daf Kuf Lamed Hey and Kuf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. As you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover. We are starting 7 lines from the bottom of Kuf Lamed Dalet Amud Beis at the words Iboya Lahu. And yesterday we, at the close of our Gemara, spoke about a din of Rav Yochanan where there was a seeming stira that sometimes if a man says Gerashti es ishti, he's ne'eman, and sometimes if a man says Gerashti es ishti, he's eno ne'eman. So what we had said yesterday is if a man says Gerashti es ishti in the past tense 4 weeks ago, so then eno ne'eman. But if he says Gerashti es ishti right now, then that is considered ne'eman. So now picking up on the lemafreya, which was eno ne'eman, right? That was what Rav Yochanan said. So says the Gemara like this. Omar lemafreya. Let's say he said the one that's eno ne'eman. So I understand if I say that I divorced my wife 4 weeks ago, that's not ne'eman. But mahu lehemune lehaba. Would we believe my retroactive line? I know 4 weeks ago you're not going to hold I was divorced, but do you agree that I'm divorced from today and on? Mi palginan dibura, olo palginan dibura. This is like one of my favorite sugyas. I love this. This is a shas sugya, as they say. Do we bifurcate the sentence that this man said into 2 parts? Here's the sentence in full. I divorced my wife 4 weeks ago. That's the sentence that we're analyzing, or 1 week ago, whatever. So Rav Mari v'Rav Zvid, Chad Amar Palginan v'Chad Amar Lo Palginan. So how does this work? Well, the 4 weeks ago part we know doesn't work. So if I say I divorced my wife 4 weeks ago, no one is going to believe me halachically that a divorce was rendered 4 weeks ago. But do we say Palginan Dibura? I divorced my wife from today and on. But 4 weeks ago, no. So how do we view this idea? So that's what the Gemara says. That's the machlokes, is do we say Palginan Dibura or no? And the Gemara says, well, I guess that's a possibility, but if that's true, we've already learned this idea. Says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom. Mai shnami de Rava. Rava taught us this idea of Palgina Dibura already. How so? To Amar Rava, Ish ploni ba al ishti. So if a man gives testimony that if let's say Ruvain gives testimony that Shimon slept with his wife. So hu ve'acher mitzdarfen lahorgo. So the husband is allowed to be an aid against Shimon. But look at the diuk. Lehorgo, velo lehorga. The only time he can be an aid is against Shimon, but of course he cannot be an aid against his wife. Why? Because they're nogeya. They're related to one another, kroven. They're not allowed to do that. So this is the Palginan Dibura. Part 1 is that Shimon slept with a woman. Part 2 is that she is my wife. So there we see from Rava that we have this idea of Palgina Dibura. He can give edus that would lead to the capital punishment of Shimon, but he can give nothing to his wife. That means we're accepting only half of his sentence. So we see that Rava taught us about Palgina Dibura. Says the Gemara, that's really not a good argument. The Rava piece is different. Why? Because betray gufe Palgina. When we're talking about 2 different people, which was the case of Rava, you have Shimon and you have the wife. So then we say Palgina. But Bechad Gufa, when we're only dealing with one person, which was our case, the man said, I divorced this woman. We're not talking about 2 Baalei Din. So then perhaps Lo Palgina. So that's why Rava is not the same as the din that we learned. Top of Kuflam at Hamid Aleph. We are going to try and go at a nice clip because we got a lot to do. Says the Gemara. There was a man that was about to die. Amru le itse leman. Who is your wife allowed to marry? Meaning, is there a din yibum? Do you have a brother? So he says, Amar le chazi le kahana rabba. She could marry the Kohen Gadol. That is not true, actually. She cannot marry the Kohen Gadol. The Rashbam says right here, Dibur hamaschil chazi le kahana, lav dafka. Ela shemuteres l'chol adam. Ve'ein zekuka liyavam. Umiu le kahana asira. Ha'al yedei migu. Amigu de Baal, Shamar Garashtis Ishti Ne'eman, Mehemninan Kedimafarish Valza. She is not allowed to marry a Kohen Gadol. We know that if a woman has been violated, she can't marry any Kohen. She certainly can't marry the Kohen Gadol, even an Almana can't marry Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara was just saying it's like an inflammatory, hyperbolic language. Just, she could even marry the Kohen Gadol. What? It's an exaggeration. Amar Rabba, yeah, my nechushla. Why wouldn't we? Why would we be concerned? We should assume that that's true. Why wouldn't that be true? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chia bar Abba, Amar Rav Yochanan, because Baal Amar Gerashtias Ishti Neman. Because it could be that if a husband says Gerashtias Ishti, he's Neman. Of course, it should be the case that we trust this person. Why wouldn't we trust this man? Says the Gemara, Amar Le Abaye, wait, did you just say Gerashtias Ishti is Neman? Yesterday we discussed this. Amar Le Abaye, V'Kiyasa Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rav Yochanan, Baal Amar Gerashtias Ishti Eno Neman. Yesterday we saw this machlokes, bringing it up again. The Gemara then reminds us of our answer that we saw yesterday. Amar Le V'Lav Milo Shanin, who didn't we give this answer? Kan Lamafreya V'Chan Lahaba. That sometimes when a man says Gerashtias Ishti and it's Mikanu Lahaba, no problem. If he says Lamafreya, it doesn't work. It says the Gemara, you get this answer and all of a sudden you're all comfortable. What does this mean? So the Rishonim here point out, if you look at the Rashbam, he speaks about this. Says the Gemara, we don't really know what the answer is. The machloka is about what Rabbi Yochanan holds, but we don't know what's emes. We just know what each Amora said. So you can't just say the answer is sufficient. Yes, it checks a box intellectually that says one could be this, one could be that, but it's not about those. We are in fact concerned. Here's what that means, Lamaisa. If a man was on his deathbed and they said, is your wife allowed to marry someone? And he says, yes, she is. She can even marry the Kohen Gadol. He's not Naaman. We need more proof. It is an insufficient amount of proof for her to marry, even if he dies. Because maybe there's a brother. Maybe there's no kids. And maybe she's really a Yavama. So that's the halach l'maisa. This is quoted in Shulchan Aruch, actually, as you can see on the side in the Ein Mishpat and Evan Ha'ezer Kufnan Beis Sif Aleph. Next case, quarter of the way down. There's a chazaka that this guy doesn't have a brother. When there's no brother, is there yibum? No. Who is she going to be Yavama to? There's no brother. And when he died, he says out loud, just so everybody hears, by the way, I'm confirming what you already know, I don't have a brother. Amar Rav Yosef, my lechushla. Why? What's the problem? Of course we should trust him. First of all, chada the muchzaklan deles ba'achin, deles le'achin. We already said there's a chazaka that he doesn't have a brother, the guy who's dying. The od ha'amar b'shas misa deles le. We have two things going for us that we should assume that there is no yibum. Number one is that there's a chazaka that he has no brother, and number two is that he said out loud that he doesn't have a brother. Because there's people across the world, there's Edim on the other side of the globe who are saying, oh, hold on, but maybe, right? That maybe in fact that there, he says, okay, but hashta mias, halesnu, come on. They're not here right now. You're pulling a name out of a hat. There might be people out there who hold that way, but they're not in Bezdin right now, so she should be able to marry based on this double assumption. Says the Gemara, Lab Hainu de Reb Chanina. Isn't this the same as Reb Chanina, who was talking about a case, a very unfortunate case, one that unfortunately we're a little too close to home with our captives, where if a woman is held in captivity, we assume that her captors violated her. We assume that. And then the Gemara, speaking about that sugya, this is a sugya we saw in Ksubas and Kedushin. The Gemara says, Amar Reb Chanina, Eidim bitzad eston v'te'aser. You have Eidim across the globe and you're going to be strict. Maybe nobody saw what happened. Why do we have to be so strict about a shvuya, a woman who was a captive? Maybe you're giving me this din d'Rabbanan that we're going to be strict. She can't be with her Kohen husband anymore. It's just, we don't know. So it says the Gemara, Amar le'abai, im hekalnu b'shvuya. I could understand being mekel in a case of shvuya, because the restriction of a Kohen husband living with his wife who was a captive is a din d'Rabbanan. Skip the parentheses, but nakel be'eshes ish. But you're going to go on a chazaka that there's no brothers when it comes to eshes ish. Perhaps there really is a din of yibum. Says the Gemara, Amar le Reb Nasa, Rava le Reb Nasa bar Ami chushla. We're concerned about this as well. So basically, a chazaka that a shchimera doesn't have brothers is not enough to allow her to remarry. She needs a birur. She needs some type of clarification, a raya, a proof, something to ensure that she is in fact not a yavama. 2/3 of the way down, a little bit more, the 2 dots, 8 lines from the bottom. The Gemara says, we spoke about a case where, let's say there's 2 brothers, Ruvain and Shimon, and then Ruvain thinks he's found out about another long-lost brother, Levi. So he walks up to Shimon and says, Shimon, there's not just 2 of us, there's a 3rd brother. So we had said in our Mishnah that Ruvain, who made the claim, he has to give half of whatever his portion was. We don't make Shimon give anything if Ruvain is the one to make the claim about the extra brother. The Idach Maika Amar, says the Gemara. What was Shimon thinking? So let's just picture the scene. Let's make it 5 brothers. Ruvain walks into a Thanksgiving meal. 5 of his brothers are sitting around the table. He says, Chevra, my brothers, I know this is crazy. We have another brother. I did a 23andMe test. This guy, Levi, he's our brother. So the Gemara wants to know, what was the reaction of the other brothers? Ika amre achunahu. If they said, wow, welcome to the family. We had no idea. Let's look at the paternity test. You're part of the family. Then then why was it that in our Mishnah we said that only Ruvain has to give of his half to this new brother? Everyone should have done it. All the other brothers should have. If they were saying he's definitely not our brother, then the Seifa doesn't make sense, because what does it say in the Seifa? What it says is, this was a din in the Mishnah, that if this new long-lost brother, Levi, all of a sudden falls into $1 million, all the brothers get it. So if the brothers agree that he's a brother, then great, they should be splitting. If they say he's not a brother, then why does the Seifa say that they get money? After all, they shouldn't get anything if they say he's not a brother. So we don't understand how the other brothers reacted to Ruvain's claim that Levi is a long lost brother. It says the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom. They didn't say yes. They didn't say that. They said, yeah, he looks like us. I guess maybe he's a brother. So what happens in a case of Ein Anu Yodin? So there, we say that in the case of Ein Anu Yodin, depends what's going on. If Ruvain makes the claim, and then there's a Yerusha, Ruvain has to give Levi a little bit of his own Yerusha, but the other brothers don't have to. Ein Anu Yodin, the halacha is not going to force him. Says the Gemara, Omar Rava, if this is true, then Zos Omeres, what we can extrapolate from here is from another Shas Sugya, one that we've seen a number of times in Shas, and that is Zos Omeres. Manali biyadcha v'halamar ini odea. Let's say that there's a transaction. You have $100 of mine, and I say I have no idea. So maybe we should say putter. Why? Because that's exactly what happened. Ruvain says to the brothers, there's a new guy here, you need to pony up. And they say, Eini Yodeh. So then we see from our Mishnah that it must be that it's putter. Well, we've been fighting about this in Shas for years. This has come up numerous times. Now we have our answer. So says the Gemara, that's not true. Abaye Omar, turning to the top of Kuf Lamed Hem base, making some good headway. Says the Gemara, no, that's not true. Perhaps in this case, in the typical case of Manali B'Yadcha B'Hal Amar Eini Yodeh, that it would still be Chayv. Shani Hacha. Our case is a little bit different. It's not Manali B'Yadcha, it's Manali Acher B'Yadcha Dami. It's really saying that Levi's money is in your possession. It's not saying that my money is in your possession, so the cases are different. So we cannot make a bridge between the two cases. That brings us to the next 2 dots at the top of Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, and we had said in our Mishnah that Mace, if this guy Levi, the possible new brother, was brought in, Mace, if he dies after he took a portion, Yachzor Nechasim L'Makoma. Well, only Ruvain had to split in order to give his Yerusha. The other brothers didn't have to. So then the money goes back to Ruvain. Says the Gemara, and this is really an ancillary sugya, one that we have learned before in Shas. Boy Rava. Let's say that someone gets a Yerusha and the field improves all by itself. Nobody touched it, nobody watered it, it just grew perfect grains. So, Mahu, what's the din in such a case? Well, let's just parse it out. In a case where there's shevach that goes up to your shoulders literally, but it's a turn of phrase. If you're the one working very hard to improve a field, then that's the same benefit is kind of falling into cash. Of course that you're going to keep that. The only question is, you have a dekel tree that on its own got bigger. Nobody watered it. When it was a sapling, the girth of the tree was 6 inches. Now it's 60 inches. Who gets the benefit of those trees? Or Arav Aska Sirton Mai, or there was ground and the waters of a river, let's say, they went over the edge and it really did a beautiful job of watering your field, and you were the beneficiary. So there we don't know. Mai, the halacha is take, we don't know. We don't know. Misha meis v'nimtzeis daitiki, shura al yirecho, a man dies, and unlike a typical case of shchiv meira, where he verbally states what he wants, here he wrote something down. It says the Gemara, it's kshura al yerecho, it's tied on his leg. It's not, doesn't actually have to be tied on his leg. The point is that there's clearly a piece of paper next to his bed. It says on it, my last will and testament of where I'm going to put all my money. Halacha l'maisa hare zo eno klum. No halachic importance at all. It's a zero. Why? Because we don't really know all of his full intentions. Maybe he would add another paragraph. We don't know. We don't know. If he said verbally, please give $1,000 to person X, the sentence is over. It's a matnas shchimera. You're done. But when it's written down, it's just a little murky. Zika bala acher. However, if that star was picked up by another person, then bein minei yorshin, bein she'en minei yorshin, dvarav kayama. Right. So we have this written document, the daitki. If it is written and it's just sitting next to his bed, it's meaningless. But if it, and obviously in a regular case of a verbal shchimera, we're good to go. But over here, if someone took the star and they were zoche, so then bein minei yorshin, bein she'en minei yorshin, anyone is going to be kona dvarav kayama. Where does the word daitiki come from? Says the Gemara, it's a notricon. Let's look at the letters daitiki. It's a document that says da tehei lemekam velios. This is the notricon. Da tehei, this will be lemekam velios, to be established, and this is what it is. Meaning, I want you to have X. It's a detailed document. How do we define a matana? Anything that says from today until after we die. Ella says the Gemara, wait 1 second. What's this weird language of from today until after I die? What if he just said me'achshav? That wouldn't be a matana. So Amar Rava Hachi Kamar. This is really what's going on. We're just about halfway down on Kuf Lamed Hamid Beis. Under what circumstances is the gift of a bari like the gift of a shchimera? Says the Gemara, that's when we're talking about the matna shchimera, where it has a din of a bari, is only when after the person dies, because the shchimera has unique powers, but a bari doesn't have unique powers. So says the Gemara, I just lost my place. Says the Gemara, Ezo hi matnas bari man shchimera de lo kani ela la'achar misa kol shekasu ba na'yom la'achar misa. That's the language that we need to see of a matnas shchimera, of a matnas bari, which is like a shchimera. And the Gemara says 5 lines before the wide lines, halfway down Kuf Lamed Hamid Beis. Yossi Rabba bar Rav Huna be'achsadra de Bei Rav. He was sitting in this open space by the base medrash of Rav. Yossi v'kamar mishmed Rav Yochanan. He quoted a din of Rav Yochanan. Shchimera shamar kisva utnu mana leploni. He says, please, this is what the shchimera says. You, my person sitting next to the shchimera, please go right and give this mana to another person. Umeis, and then he dies on the spot. Sentence leaves his mouth and he dies. Ein kosvim denosnim. Done. We do not do anything. It's a shchimera. Yeah. But shemalo gamar lahaknosa lebishtar. Ve'ein shtar la'achar misa. Maybe the only kinyan he wanted to make was with a shtar and not verbal, but he died. We couldn't finish the sugya. We don't know. But the problem is, ein shtar la'achar misa. There is no shtar. The enforcement of a shtar can happen, but you can't issue a shtar after misa. Amar lehu Rabbi Lazar izda ruba. Rabbi Lazar says we should be very careful with this idea of ein shtar la'achar misa. Rav Shezvi Amar. Rabbi Lazar Amra. Rabbi Lazar was the one who said the din. But Amar lu Rabbi Yochanan izda ruba. And really, Rav Yochanan was the one who said we should be careful with this thing. And Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak kavase de Rav Shezvi mistabra. It's more logical to say like Rav Shezvi that Rabbi Lazar was the one who said the core comment, and Rav Yochanan backed it up. Why? Here's where it's good to know some Amoraic history of whose Rebbe was who. If you want to say Rabbi Lazar taught the basic din, and Rav Yochanan came to back him up in Israel, Rav Yochanan Ashu De'alei Rabbi Lazar, that makes sense. Why? Because Rav Yochanan was the Rebbe of Rabbi Lazar. Rav Yochanan was like end of first, really into the second generation of Amoraim. Rabbi Lazar was a Talmud, he was a third generation of Amoraim. So it makes sense that a Rebbe will say, yes, my Talmud is saying good. Rabbi Yochanan will say about Rabbi Lazar, good job. Elai Amris, we're 3 lines into the wide lines. Elai Amris, Rabbi Yochanan Amra. Rabbi Yochanan said the basic din, and Israel, Rabbi Lazar, Lashu De'alei, Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi, Achutz B'naira. Just imagine sitting in shul, and Rabbi Robinson, Rabbi Shechter, they get up and they say a beautiful Dvar Torah, they give a Psak Halacha. And someone from the crowd is like, yes, they are correct. It's a chutzpah. The Talmud doesn't say to the Rebbe, you did a good job. So it has to be like Rav Shezvi. It has to be that Rabbi Lazar said the din, and the Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan, came down and said, Shtempel, I agree with you, 100%. And furthermore, I'll bring you another raya that Rav Shezvi is right. Tashmad Rabbi Lazar Amra. I can prove it to you. The Shalach Rabin Mishmed Rabbi Abo Habu Yod, and you should know Shalach Rabbi Lazar Lagola Mishum Rabbeinu. Rabbi Lazar sent something to the Gola, to outside of Eretz Yisrael, in the name of Rabbeinu, in the name of Rabbi. Now the first din, we'll just read it. It says the Gemara Shchime Rosh Amar Kisvu Utnu Mana Laploni Umeis. This was the din that we were talking about. Ein kosvin v'nosnin shemalo gamer laknos elu ishtar vein shtar lachar misa. So what do we see? That Rebbe Lazar was the one who said it. And then what happens next? Rabbi Yochanan Amar Tibadeg. Rabbi Yochanan says a different language than what we saw before. He says Tibadeg. Asks the Gemara, "My Tibadeg." He also Rav Dimi says, what does it mean Tibadeg? Amar daitiki mivateles daitiki. Tibadeg means that we should check very carefully. And what that means is that one written document of a shchimera will cancel out the previous one. If there's one after another, one is dated January 1st, the other was dated January 2nd, the one on January 2nd wins. We're going to discuss this din more at a later point, not today. But the Gemara here continues to bring this final raya that Rabbi Lazar was the one who said the fundamental din, and then Rabbi Yochanan came to give the shtempel. And the Shchime Rasham Kisvu Utnu Mana Laploni Umeis Ron. We take a look. In Kimiyapes Kocho Kosvin Es Kocho Kosvin. If the whole reason why the Shchime said he wanted it in writing was befrat, to make sure that he knew that the money would transfer, then that's okay. But if the way that the document was written was not to be miyape koko of the recipient, to make him a stronger candidate, so then under those circumstances, says the Gemara, b'imlav ein kosvin. Masir Ravav Bar Mamal, he says, hang on one second. Bari she'amar, we have a statement from a brisa, and the statement from the brisa says like this. If we have a bari that says, kisvu tnu mana laploni umeis, when a bari says it, ein kosvin unosnin, which implies something, which implies that hashchim era kosvin unosnin. That doesn't make sense. Because if it's true that by a bari it is ein kosvin unosnin, that if a shchim era says, I want you to please write this, we don't listen by a bari, that implies that by a shchim era we do. But that's a stira. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Abba Bar Mamel, who mosiv love, who mefarek la, bottom line of Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, b'miyapes kocha. When do we say that a shchimera is kosvin? Let's say a shchimera says, hey, can you please write up a star and give this to person X? So the Maisa, we don't listen to him unless it's a yipui koch, unless it's going to strengthen the position of the person who he's talking about to collect. And ask the Gemara, last few words on Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, Heichi dami miyape es kocho. How does it make it even better? So says the Gemara, top of Kuf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. We're going to be heading to the two dots all the way toward the bottom of the page, and then Reb Ruvain Handler will be giving shiur on Shabbos for me. So this is what it means when we say that we're talking about yipui koach. We're adding in this language v'kanina minei. He's making a kinyan for me. Mosif al masnasada, and this is in addition to the matana. I'm adding in this extra word of kinyan. I'm giving you a matana and v'kanina, which is interesting because we have this in our ksubas. I wonder if this is where this kind of comes from. Hachanami, the Gemara says in our case too, the Amar af ksuba v'chasumu v'habule. I just want you to write it out and sign it and make sure that he gets it. So that's what the Gemara says is yipui koach. Therefore, let's review. If a shchiv meira says verbally, I hereby give money to person X, that's in the bag because there's no confusion about a star. That's a verbal. Shchiv meira, he gets it, whatever he wants. Matna shchiv meira is in the bag. If he says ksuvu, then it depends. If it's a yipui koach, if it's just another way to guarantee that the money will go to the recipient, no problem. What's that like? That's if you add v'kanina, sharp, strong language in the writing. But if it's not a yipui koach, then it doesn't help, and then even the shchiv meira will not get that transaction taken into effect. Itmar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha kosvin v'nosen halacha l'maisa kosvin v'nosen l'chein Amar Rava Amar Rab Nachman halacha kosvin v'nosen. We in fact do give it after death, provided that it's miyapes kocho. That's what the Rashbam writes. That brings us to a new Mishnah on Kuf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. The Gemara says that kosev nechasav lebanav. If a man writes over all of his properties to his son, sarach sheyichtov mehayomu la'achar misa, he needs to write. If you're giving that gift, it's from today until after the father's death. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Omer einot sarach. He doesn't need to write this. Hakosev nechasav lebno la'achar moso. So let's just get the language over here. Actually, sorry. Oh, that's not going to change. Hakosev nechasav, last of the short lines, kuf lam vav menal. Hakosev nechasav levno la'achar mo. So a person writes over his properties to his son for after he dies. Ha'av eino yachol limkor. If he writes that, but he hasn't died yet, the father can't sell he can't sell what's in the Yerusha. Mimnei shein ksuvin lebed. Right? If the father says that he says about himself that after his death, you get my property at 123 Main Street, but he lives another 2 years. So says the Gemara, the father can't sell it. The son can't sell it either because he doesn't own it yet. The father didn't die. If in fact the father broke the rule and sold this property, it's sold. The sale counts, but only until the day he dies. On that day, it returns back to the son because that's what the father stipulated. But machar haben, if the son were to have sold it, he doesn't own it until the father dies, and therefore his sale is null and void out of the gates. Nothing happened. Says the Gemara, what's this weird language of the Tana Kama? The Tana Kama says that if you're kosev nechasav lebanav, you have to say mehayom ula'achar misa. V'chikosav mehayom ula'achar misa mai habe. How does that help? Says the Gemara, it's not. What do we have in our Mishnah? Me'ayum ula'achar misa, get ve'ino get. That language is not definitive at all. If a man were to say about a get, me'ayum ula'achar misa, this kind of almost like a opposing language, it's mehayom and la'achar misa. So get ve'ino get. That's a suffix get. We don't even know if she's divorced. The language is not definitive at all. So how could you, the Tana Kama, in this case, by kosev nechasav lebanav, require that it says me'ayom ula'achar misa? That language is not definitive. It's very confusing, actually. So says the Gemara, not only that, if he were to die with this get, she's choletzes v'lo misya bemes. It's mamish a suffix by getting to say the language mehayom ula'achar misa. So says the Gemara, Hasam by an isha, when you're talking about a get, mesafkol and ituna habe chazar habe. There, we're not sure what the status was of the get. Abal hach in our case, hachik amarle. In regards to the case of kosev nechasav lebanav, he has to say mehayom ula'achar misa because it's basically like saying this: Gufa kani mehayom pira la'achar misa. Oh, a little bit of a subtlety that we didn't have in the Mishnah. What he means to say is that the gufa, the principle is kona today, but the father still wanted the peros, and therefore peros are la'achar misa. So now we understand the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. The case was a kosev nechasav lebanav, that you have to say meyom la'achar misa. What did he mean? So says the Gemara, what the Gemara means is that the father was splitting things in half. As it relates to the principle, I have an orchard, and it's valued at $1.5 million to my dear son. Immediately, the son owns the $1.5 million. But any payros that grow after that day go to the father until the father dies. That's what the din of the Tana Kama is. Rabbi Yossi Omer Eino Tzarich. So what does this mean? Says the Gemara tells a story. Rabba bar Avua Chalash. Rabba bar Avua was sick. All legabe Rav Huna of Rav Nachman. They came to do the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. Amar le Rav Huna le Rav Nachman. While you're there, ask him, how does he paskin? How does Rabbi Baravua paskin? Do we hold like Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, that in the case of kosev nechasav lebanav, he does not need to say meyom la'achar misa, yes or no? Time of Rabbi Yossi lo yadana halachi. We don't even know what the svara is by Rabbi Yossi to not say the phrase of meyom la'achar to say the phrase meyom la'achar misa. You want me to ask him how we paskin? We have no idea what Rabbi Yossi's shita means in the first place. Amarle, don't worry. Just tell me how. Ask Rabbi Baravua how we paskin. The time I'll tell you the svara behind the shita of Rabbi Yossi. So Bamine Amarle Hachi Amar Rab. He says Rabbi Yossi we paskin like Rabbi Yossi that if a person's kosev nechasav lebanav, he doesn't have to say this odd splitting language of me'ayim alachar misa. So that's seemingly how we paskin. And the Gemara then says, Basra Danafku, after they came out, they Rav Huna, who had said to Rav Nachman, can you find out the halacha? He said to him, Hainu Taimad Rabbi Yossi. Rav Nachman says, what's the svar of Rabbi Yossi? Because the Amar Zmano Shel Shtar Mochiach Alav. The date on the shtar tells me what's going on. If the sale is supposed to take first on Aleph ER, then the sale takes first on Aleph ER. That's it. I don't need your weird language from today until tomorrow. So the Tana Kama is of the opinion that we need this language of me'ayom ula'achar misa, and we explained in the Gemara that's because the principle is kona to the child today. The peiros are not. But Rabbi Yossi has a whole different. We just look at the date. Well, we're not talking about a difference between the peiros and the keren. That's not what we're talking about. So they just have very differing approaches to our Mishnah. Brisa that supports this shita as well. This is in fact quoted in Shulchan Aruch like the shita of Rabbi Yossi, that if a child receives all of the property from his father, the shtar should not say Mayom Ulachar Misa, quoted in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Nun Ches in Choshen Mishpat. We're about 2/3 of the way down, and then we'll stop at the two dots. The Gemara says, Boy minei Rava me Rav Nachman behaknoa mahu. What if we had a language of Kinyan? Would that help? It says because mehayom ulachar misa is not a language of Kinyan. What if we added behaknoa? Amarli behaknoa no tzarich. He said we don't need the language of Aknoa. Rav Papi Amar ika aknisa de tzarich, ika aknisa de lo tzarich. Depends. There are some languages of Kinyan that work, and there are some languages of Kinyan that don't. Akniye v'kanina mine lo tzarich. If the language was double, we have akniye v'kanina. We would never have understood this without the Rishonim. The Gemara says akniye is a language where the Baal tells someone to make a kinyan, and v'kanina means that the kinyan was actually made. That's lo tzarich. We don't need the language of mehayom in such a case. Kanina mine v'akniye, if it's the other way, that a kinyan was made and I had asked someone to make a kinyan, it's actually out of sequence, then tzarich, we do need the language of mehayom ulachar misa. I says the Gemara Maskif lo Rav Chanina Misura miika midi de anan lo yadinan v'safra yade. I can barely tell the difference, says the Gemara, between akniye and kanina. They're so similar. The lamdanim have to figure this out. The people sitting in the base medrash pounding the pavement have to figure out akniye v'kanina. You think the sofrim know? I mean, come on, it's such a nuance. So they went to go to the sofer in the bezdin of Abaye. He was a big Talmid Chacham. He's like, of course, Akniye is different than Mekanina. And Ulasafre de Rava V'yade, he also knew. Rav Huna Breder Rishu Amar, Bein Akniye v'Kanina mine, Bein Kanina mine v'Akniye. Whatever order you write these things in, lo tzarich. You never need to have that language of Mehayom, Ula'achar Misa. We pasken like Rabbi Yossi. Uveduchran, in a place where Piskime Dahavi Be'an Pinapligi. We're talking about a case where the Eidim were giving testimony about when something actually happened, and that's where there's a machlokes. And similarly, Amar Rav Kahana Amrisa L'Shmaisa Kamid Rav Zvid Minarta. They were talking about this din. Do we need this double language? Yes or no? Of Kanina and Akniye. Do we follow these rules? And the Sofrim would know what to write. Amarli Atun Hachi Masnisula. That's how you guys learn it. Ana Hachi Masninala. We learn it a little differently than you. Amar Rav Nachman Ba'akna Inu Tzarech. If there's a language of Kinyan, we don't need to write the language of Mehayom Ula'achar Misa. And Bein Akniye v'Kanina Minei, Bein Kanina Minei v'Akniye. We don't care what order it is. If we're talking about the people who I sent to go make a Kinyan, or whether or not it was a Kinyan already made, or vice versa, lo tzarech. We don't need the language of Me'ayom Ula'achar Misa and B'duchran Piskimei Dehavu Ba'an Pinapligi. But there is a machlokes about this when the testimony is about something that happened in front of their eyes. A lot of information. A little bit drinking from a fire hose tonight, but we're going to stop right here. And Rabbi Handler will pick up from here on Shabbos. I've already told him where to start from. On Shabbos, Mincha is at 2:30, the early Mincha, and Daf Yomi will follow. We're probably going to be holding that pattern for a while because there's kimat no difference between the two, and it probably just helps people more than it hurts them. Stop right here. Wishing you all a beautiful night.